32, and I call the member for Denison.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, in 2015 I gave a speech in this place in which I characterised Australia as having reached a pre-police state. And in that speech I went into some detail lamenting the concerns in the community at the way our democracy has been diminished, the way our liberties have been diminished. And I think I spoke on behalf of a great many members of the community, people who had seen or experienced or sensed or just suspected that our country was evolving in a negative way, and that things that we used to take for granted we could no longer take for granted, that there was being an unreasonable extension of the power of the state in this country, and it had gone beyond any reasonable sort of limit. Well, Deputy Speaker, I regret to say that as I stand here today and talk about this bill, nothing's changed. In fact, if this bill is to become law, then things will be getting worse. Because remember what this bill would allow. It would allow the minister to ban whatever he wants from immigration detention centres, to extend the existing screening, search and seizure powers, including strip searches. It would allow areas of immigration detention to be searched without a warrant, and it would allow the use of detector dogs not just to screen detainees, but even people visiting an immigration detention centre. In other words, this bill goes beyond any reasonable sort of attempt to improve the way activities are conducted in immigration detention centres. What it does, in effect, is to go another step closer to turning immigration detention centres into jails. But in some ways it goes beyond that, and is even worse than that. But because our jails in all of the jurisdictions, at least they conform, or they sit within a framework of carefully considered laws and legislation. Before someone goes to jail, they would normally have been suspected of an offence, they would have been charged, they would have had their day in court where they would have had legal representation, and what goes on inside those prisons would be overseen by the state and territory governments. Of course, in this case, what the government is seeking to do is to be able to go even further in the way it can, completely outside the justice system, can grab a hold of someone in the community and can detain them indefinitely without charge. Those people in those immigration detention centres, they haven't necessarily been suspected of any wrongdoing, they haven't been charged with anything, they haven't had a day in court, they haven't had a chance to be legally represented. They're just jailed indefinitely without charge on the whim of a government official or of the relevant minister in this government. And this is really alarming. I mean, when it comes to irregular immigration to this country, when it comes to immigration matters, this government thinks it can act outside of any law. It thinks it can create these almost black sites where it can just grab someone off the street and lock them up indefinitely without trial, with very few rights, and if this bill becomes law, even less rights. There is no procedural fairness. There's no fairness whatsoever. It is completely outside of any sort of proper legal framework and outside of any proper legal process. Why on earth would the government want to do this, Deputy Speaker? Why would the government be wanting to do this and behave in this way? Well, I think for a number of reasons. I think it's another effort by the government to demonise people who are involved with immigration matters, and in particular to demonise people who come to this country or attempt to come to this country through irregular means, and I'm talking, of course, about asylum seekers in particular. But in doing that, it's changing, the whole immigration detention arrangement, and ensuring that anyone in the community who is not an Australian citizen, who is even just merely suspected of something, is thrown in one of these immigration detention centres. Surely, Deputy Speaker, in a healthy and law-abiding country like Australia, if there's someone in the community of any nationality who is suspected of any wrongdoing, and the government likes to say, well, you know, suspected sex offenders or members of bikie gangs or whatnot, well, if any of these people have actually done anything wrong or are suspected on reasonable grounds of having done anything wrong, surely they should be charged in front of court in Australia. What's this about putting them in these mysterious immigration detention centres without trial, in some cases indefinitely, which is a punishment in itself, and then sending the problem to some other country? It's a simple fact that if someone has done something wrong in this country, done something wrong according to Australian law in this country, then we should deal with that matter in this country and they should front a court in this country. They certainly shouldn't be put in an immigration detention centre. Now, Deputy Speaker, some years ago now, 2014, I approached the International Criminal Court and I brought to their attention the concern of many Australians that the Australian government, a series of Australian governments in fact, had been in breach of the Rome Statute, and in particular that a series of Australian governments, including this one now, are guilty of crimes against humanity for a whole range of reasons, and in particular contrary to Article 7, which is to do with crimes against humanity in the Rome Statute, which covers things like, or in particular, it covers imprisonment and other severe deprivation of physical liberty in violation of fundamental rules of international law, and the deportation and other forcible transfer of people, or the population, and other intentional acts causing great suffering or serious injury to body and mental physical health. That relevant part of the Rome Statute sounds as relevant today and as relevant with this bill as it sounded on any other number of occasions in recent years and during the terms of a number of governments in recent times. So I'll be sending my concerns with this bill to the International Criminal Court as well, and they can add it to the file. And I suspect it's quite a hefty file. It does raise the question, Deputy Speaker, when is an Australian government going to start acting like the government of a lucky and wealthy and civilised country? When is an Australian government going to start respecting international law when it comes to immigration matters? I've already spoken in a little bit of detail there about how, in my opinion, a number of Australian governments have failed to comply with the Rome Statute, which is an important international agreement which we have signed up to. I think it's also self-evident that a series of Australian governments, including this government, are also failing to abide with the Refugee Convention, with the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Deputy Speaker, what is so hard about understanding the importance of international law? What is so hard about understanding that we've signed up to those agreements in good faith because we thought they were important, and they're still important and we should still comply with them? But it seems to be the case that with Australian governments these days, international law is only important when it suits us. And when it comes to immigration matters, and in particular irregular immigration to this country, it doesn't suit us, so we ignore it. And in doing so, Deputy Speaker, when it comes to immigration issues, this country has become a pariah among the community of nations. It is simply unconscionable the way we deal with irregular immigrants to this country. And it's even more unconscionable when you think that the international situation, the global situation when it comes to displaced people, is even worse now than at any other time, far worse even than at the end of the Second World War. Looking at the UNHCR's figures, Deputy Speaker, currently 65.6 million people forcibly displaced worldwide. 65.5 million people forcibly displaced worldwide, of which more than 20 million are refugees, 10 million stateless people. No wonder countries like Turkey are hosting 2.9 million of these people, Pakistan hosting 1.5 million of these people, Lebanon 1 million, Iran about 1 million, Uganda about 1 million, Ethiopia 750,000. This enormous global challenge, and the burden is being shouldered by a small number of countries and not ours. And it's simply not good enough, Deputy Speaker, for this government and previous governments to crow and say, oh, but we're the first or the second or third best in the world when it comes to the number of people we take in through a humanitarian program. That's cooking the books, Deputy Speaker, because that's referring only to the percentage of people that are taken through the UNHCR program, and it completely ignores the fact that millions more, tens of millions of more, are displaced and are refugees. We are not a generous country, Deputy Speaker. We are not a generous country. And we're going to be a whole lot less generous if this bill becomes law. How dare the minister and the government think that it's appropriate to be taking these sorts of actions when it comes to immigration detention centre, which are mostly filled with simple immigration matters. They're not full of sex offenders and bikies. They're full of regular people, many of whom are awaiting a simple immigration determination, often because they've attempted to come to Australia because they've been fleeing for their life. Deputy Speaker, this bill is unsupportable, and I certainly won't be supporting it. No wonder, Deputy Speaker, just in the last 12 months, I think I've counted 5 different episodes where the United Nations has criticised Australia. And of course some people in this place will say, well, who cares about the United Nations, they're discredited. Well, they're not discredited. At the end of the day, the United Nations is the best we've got, and it is the one body where the community of nations comes together and can speak as one. And for this country to have been criticised, I count 5 times in the last 12 months because of our response to asylum seekers, is simply unconscionable. In the last 12 months, we've had the head of the UNHCR, no less, criticise Australia. We've had the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights criticise Australia. A United Nations team at Papua New Guinea, about a year ago, criticised our response to asylum seekers. The UN Human Rights Council criticised Australia's response to asylum seekers. And quite recently, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination criticised Australia. Listen, I'm proud of this country, and I'm proud of everything that we've achieved and what we can become. But I am ashamed of the way this country, the way it responds to asylum seekers. I'm ashamed of the fact that we have mandatory detention, that we have offshore processing, that we have towbacks, that we have temporary protection visas. I'm ashamed of the fact that we've got the Republic of Nauru being used as a prison island for people, most of whom have simply tried to make it to Australia because they're fleeing for their life. I'm ashamed of the fact that there are hundreds of men on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea that have been supposedly released only to do their best to survive in a hostile community, an understandably hostile community, because they've got their own concerns about what these hundreds of men from other countries are suddenly doing wandering their streets and trying their best to live in substandard accommodation and facilities with completely inadequate services being provided for them. I'm ashamed of all this. Mark my words, Deputy Speaker, when the history books are written about this period in Australian history, going back the period from a few decades up till now, and particularly now, those historians will lament the fact that this country responded to asylum seekers in the way it has. It's not going to say what a wonderful country because we stopped the boats. Those historians are going to lament the fact that we completely and utterly lost any respect for relevant international laws, that we became an international pariah, that we had ministers and governments who thought it was okay with people in immigration detention to extend the screening, search and seizure powers, including strip searches, to have dogs sniffing not just the inmates in these effective jails, what are effectively jails, but even people visiting them, and to be able to search without a warrant, to be able to ban anything we want, to in effect establish these black sites where we can dump any non-Australian citizen indefinitely without trial in dreadful circumstances and think it's okay. Well, Deputy Speaker, it's not okay. I hope and I expect the opposition in here to vote against this bill, and I'm sure a number of the crossbenchers are going to vote against it, including myself. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.